Once upon a time, we lived on a planet with a stable climate. It started after Earth's last glacial period some 11,650 years ago. The climate warmed up to degrees that suited our human ancestors. Climate is different from weather. Weather is what you experience from day to day. Climate is the statistical average of weather conditions over a long period of time. In fact, it was during this period of climate stability that all of human history unfolded. All our writings, technologies, agriculture, civilizations, everything. This is the geological epoch called the Holocene, or maybe the epoch that was the Holocene. Over the last few decades, geologists and climatologists have argued that we have left the Holocene and entered a new time, where for the first time, human activity alters the planet Earth on a geological scale. A name has been proposed for this new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. In this new geological epoch, industrial activity, above all the burning of fossil fuels and the intensive farming of animals, has altered the thermal composition of the Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide and methane from these industries have built up greenhouse gases that lead to global warming. The greenhouse effect is when certain forms of radiation from the sun bounce off the Earth's surface and then get trapped in the atmosphere by certain gases, like carbon dioxide and methane. This is turning Earth into a less habitable planet and leading to a loss of climate stability that's been so important to our species. Extreme weather events, rising water, ocean acidification, deforestation, and species extinction. And actually, we're currently living through the sixth mass extinction event. There have been 5 before this one, the most well-known being the extinction of the dinosaurs some 66 million years ago, also known as the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. What's different about this extinction event is that it's not a meteor for outer space that's leading to all this species die-off, but human activity. And when it comes to the 6th mass extinction, industrial animal agriculture is the major culprit. So, like anthropogenic global warming, species extinction and biodiversity loss is due to human activity. This all sounds very dire, and I'm afraid it is. Climate anxiety is a very real thing. But it doesn't really help to be defeatist. There are ways of contributing to and fighting for a better climate future. Joining organizations like the Sunrise Movement can be empowering. So is making demands on our political representatives to sponsor the Green New Deal, which is necessary to decarbonize our economies and limit the global heating to 1.5 or maybe 2 degrees Celsius by century's end, so we can avoid the worst-case scenario. We can also be conscious about what we consume. We can get involved in food empowerment projects that organize for healthier and more nutritious foods, especially in poorer communities. When possible, we can move towards a plant-based diet, which studies show is better for the environment than animal products. A recent study by Oxford University shows that changing the way we eat is the single biggest thing we can do as individuals for the environment. But above all, the responsibility should not rest on our shoulders and those of individual consumers. It's the very wealthy and powerful who own the environmentally damaging industries who have to change their business models, which so far have been predicated on ecological destruction. By living through the Anthropocene, we have a very different conception of nature than all of previous human history. And this might sound strange, because what could be more natural, quote-unquote, than nature? Well, once again, that's ideology talking. If you think about it, the natural world is something that's been interpreted by many different cultures and in many different ways. Yes, nature is something that's found. It's a real thing out there. But at the same time, it's also something we make. Nature is also, in part, a human construction and sometimes projection. Here's just a brief list of some of the ways nature has been understood in human history. Nature as a mother, as in Mother Nature. The Greek personification of the earth was called Gaia, and she was a goddess, though the female gendering of earth is not limited to Greek culture. Nature as a living organism that will self-correct and stabilize itself, which incidentally is called the Gaia hypothesis. Some talk of Gaia's revenge against human activity and its extremes. Nature as a divine being, imbued with spiritual significance, for example, in non-Western animist traditions, whereby all of nature is filled with life energy. Nature as an arena of struggle, competition, violence, and death. This was memorably put by Tennyson in one of his poems, where he says that nature is red tooth and claw. Though it turns out that cooperation and care are just as important and visible in the natural world, notably in animal communities and social groups. Nature is a place that's distinct from human culture. In other words, that there's a divide between human culture and non-human nature. Or, as recent philosophers argue, nature is a place that's always connected to human culture, whereby there is no clear divide between culture and nature. Nature is a source of economic value, be it the exploitation of living animals, forests, or inorganic resources like valuable and useful minerals. This is the extractivist conception of the natural world. Nature is a place that stays out of our minds, like when we turn on the lights, flush our toilets, eat our foods, all without thinking about where they come from or where they go. This is nature as an unthought or unconscious place. Nature is a place to escape, to get away from the pressures and ills of urban life, like going on a hike or a meditative retreat. All these are just a few examples of how nature has been understood and coded, often in mutually exclusive and contradictory ways. And this is what we're up to in this session, seeing how nature has been interpreted in various artworks across different cultures. One of the most influential periods in Western history on nature was Romanticism. At the very moment the Industrial Revolution was taking off in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Romantic artists turned to the environment for creative purposes. Above all, they understood nature as an awe-inspiring force. Here's a really great example. This is by J.M. Turner. It's a history painting showing the Carthaginian general Hannibal leading his army across the Italian Alps to fight the Romans in 218 before the Common Era. This was part of the Punic Wars between Carthage and the Roman Republic. Way off in the distance, barely noticeable, is Hannibal himself, riding his elephant. Elephants were used as war machines. Alexander the Great also used elephants in war, basically as living tanks. And even today, we use non-human animals in war. For example, the U.S. Navy uses dolphins to retrieve objects in the ocean or for detecting mines. Although Turner's painting shows us a historical event from ancient history, it was also an allegory for a more recent episode in European history, namely Napoleon's army crossing the Alps. But looking at this picture, you'd be excused for thinking that Turner is more interested in showing the power of natural forces than military ones. Human activity is diminutive compared to the massive storm, a dark vortex that swirls up from the bottom of the painting in curls like a huge dark blue wave that's about to break. The sun is peeking through, though it looks like no more than a faintly glowing disk, creating some really interesting visual effects and depth. Light and even a patch of blue sky in the distance, while haze and murkiness dominate at the right side of the painting. I highly recommend listening to the first movement of Richard Strauss's The Alpine Symphony while looking at this painting, preferably in spatial audio for maximum effect between music and picture. It was around this time that a key philosophical theory was put forward, most notably the Irish philosopher Edmund Burke and the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. This was the theory of the sublime. The sublime is an aesthetic experience in front of something that's far greater than us. In the Romantic period, this sublime experience was often linked to natural forces and phenomena, like the massiveness of the ocean, a mountain range, or a storm, like the one Turner is depicting here. Burke claimed that the sublime is linked to both pain and pleasure, and that when experienced together, we experience a release of emotion, what's known as a cathartic experience. Kant went further in trying to explain the sublime. He agrees that it's a feeling of fear and danger, but a feeling of fear and danger that's accompanied by relative safety. In other words, it's feeling fear while also knowing that you're actually at a safe distance from what you fear. So if you've ever been to a haunted house, you might know what it feels like to be scared, but also reassured that it's all an act. Or when watching a horror movie, what you're seeing on screen might be fear-inducing, but ultimately you know that you're safe in your seat, at home, or in the theater. Well, that's probably what 19th century viewers felt in front of Turner's Snowstorm, a thrill at experiencing this impending storm cascading down on their heads, along with a pleasure at being outside the painting and in the safety of the gallery. For Kant, this feeling of the sublime was related to what he deemed to be the superiority of human reason over nature. that human rationality has been able to tame, order, and understand natural forces, even the scary ones. This power over the natural world is very much part of the Western conception of nature, as you'll see a bit later on in this session. Now let's move on to some non-Western examples, specifically of architecture and design, since these often use and work with the natural environments they find themselves in. Let's start in Japan with a very famous rock garden in Kyoto. This rock garden at Ryoanji is one of the most iconic works of Zen Buddhism in Japan. We can trace the origins of Zen Buddhism back through Korea and Vietnam to Chan Buddhism in China. Zen literally means meditation. It's a practice of self-discipline, restraint, and attention to the small details around us. The founder of Chan Buddhism, which would become Zen, was Bodhidharma. He was so uncompromisingly committed to meditation that after falling asleep while meditating, he cut off his eyelids so that it wouldn't happen again. This type of self-control was popular among the warrior classes in Japan, the samurai. In fact, during the Kamakura period in Japan, the samurai Minamoto Yorimoto became the shogun, the military leader, and assumed power. During this period and the next, the Muromachi period, great works of art were commissioned to reflect this practice of Zen, including this rock garden at Ryoanji. It's a slightly imperfect rectangle, 75 by 29 feet, filled with a sea of rocks that get raked into various patterns. 15 rocks on moss beds rise up from the garden at various intervals. This creates a lovely sense of openness and space. These rocks have been interpreted in a few ways, as islands in the ocean, as mountaintops piercing through the top of clouds, and as a late 18th century guidebook tells it, as a mother tiger carrying her cubs across a river. The real point of this rock garden is not so much interpretation as it is meditation. You no longer can walk directly in the garden and around the rock formations, but you can sit next to it and contemplate the shapes and patterns for yourself. And one of the key features of Zen Buddhism is sudden enlightenment, often brought on by a small detail in the world. This rock garden, but also the natural world at large, can facilitate these sudden moments of illumination if one is attentive to its true qualities. Zen Buddhism teaches to let go and be surprised by the world. And it really is incredible to think how much we miss in our daily lives by not paying attention to the small details around us. In this sense, in Zen Buddhism, nature is imbued with a special significance. It can be the teacher and the object of meditation. It's also important to note that the rock garden is not to be understood in isolation, like a painting usually is in a museum. No, the background elements and everything around it are also in dialogue with it, so that cherry tree blossoming in the background and other temples and gardens around it, including this really beautiful one that's completely carpeted with moss, are all in dialogue with this rock garden. And so it remains completely open to its surroundings. And this way of being open, of remaining open, of letting things happen, of embracing chance, was hugely influential on John Cage, an important avant-garde composer who used all manner of things to create sounds in his music. Zen Buddhism became quite popular in the United States after World War II, and Cage himself talked about his appreciation of this very rock garden in Ryoanji. Here we have the greatest building of the Mughal Empire in Agra, India, the Taj Mahal. It was common for Mughal emperors to build mausolea for their royal family members. A mausoleum is simply a building or freestanding structure that houses a burial chamber. This is a spectacular example by Shah Jahan, who ruled from 1628 to 1658. His wife, Mumtaz Mahal, died in 1631, and he built the Taj Mahal for her. This has to be the largest and most elaborate tomb in the world. The structure is made entirely of white marble, which denotes purity. It's framed by 4 minarets and has incredibly delicate and elaborate designs engraved on the marble outside the building, including flower patterns and calligraphic inscriptions of verses from the Quran. While the rock garden like the rock garden we just saw, the Taj Mahal should not be seen in isolation. Even in this up-close photograph, this much is clear. Notice how much of the building is reflected in the long reflecting pool. This is one of the many ways in which it connects to the natural elements that have been purposely designed to evoke a lush, heavenly realm. Here we see it from an aerial view, which gives us a nice sense of the whole complex. The reflecting pool is actually a crisscross design that goes in 4 different directions, which form 4 different quadrants. This is called a charbagh. It leads straight to the sandstone gateway, which is an amazing structure in its own right. There are other buildings too, a mosque and an assembly hall. In this aerial photo, you can see the assembly hall sitting to the right of the Taj Mahal. The mosque is to the left, but just outside this photograph's frame. During Shah Jahan's time, there would have been 44 different garden complexes. There was also, just behind the Taj Mahal and past the Jumna River, a garden the same size as the one facing the Taj Mahal, which was called the Moonlight Garden, and would have also had 4 quadrants and a reflecting pool. All around, there are flowers and fruit trees planted, which echoed the designs on the Taj Mahal itself, and so the whole complex is meant to symbolize paradise. And so for the Islamic Mughal Empire, nature was conceived as a mirror of heaven. Here's the Great Serpent Mound, which is in Ohio, not too far from Cincinnati. It's an effigy mound. An effigy is simply a sculpture that's made to represent a figure, in this case, a 1,371-foot-long snake that curves along the grassy earth. The practice of making earthen mounds, often to bury people, goes back centuries. Usually, though, these mounds are pyramidal or conical shaped, making this one really stand out. We don't know exactly when it was first built, but we do know that the Adena people, a native culture to this part of North America, built mounds nearby and likely upkept the Serpent Mound. We also know that this specific plot of land is an impact crater from a meteor. And that's not the only celestial connection. It's believed that the shape of the snake matches the Draco constellation in the sky. Draco means dragon, which is sort of fitting. The curves of the snake also seem to be aligned with the seasons and the solstices. We're not sure about any of this, and it's difficult to say how the people who made the snake effigy interpreted it for themselves. One thing is for sure, that whoever made it, it was in dialogue with the natural elements, both below and above, and it likely had some sort of spiritual significance. Another interesting thing to think about, whoever made this could never have seen it from this perspective in the air. Maybe someone could have climbed a tree to see the snake a bit better, but still not in its totality. We take this for granted, especially in our age of drone and satellite photography. Back then, only birds could see it from the air. Today, so can we. If I could choose to visit only one site in the world, I think I would pick this one, Machu Picchu in Peru, South America. I've always been fascinated by it. It was made by the Inca people for their ruler named Pachacuti in the 15th century. It was one of many country estates, a getaway from the capital at Cusco. Thousands of laborers had to raise off the top of a mountain and built numerous shrines and houses, some 200 buildings in all. One of the most interesting aspects of Machu Picchu is how it relates to the natural elements around it. The Incas had an important concept for this called Tincuy. Tincuy was the meeting place between 2 important forces or energies, often between natural elements and built elements. So, for example, door frames at Machu Picchu will be positioned in such a way that they corresponded to the surrounding mountains. Because of this, in Inca architecture and design, there always seems to be a balance between human and non-human activity. They didn't try to completely dominate the land with what they were making. Instead, they echoed nature and worked with it, around it, and in sync with it. Whenever I see images of Machu Picchu, this is the aspect that strikes me the most. Here's a civilization that lived with nature and not against it. This all makes sense when you're introduced to their spiritual practices. For the Incas, nature is filled with spiritual energy. This energy is called Kame, which is essentially a life force that courses through everything, organic and inorganic, animate and inanimate, human and non-human. This is an animist tradition, which many non-Western belief systems share. Of utmost importance is the sun, and then the moon. And then the Incas even already discovered the Milky Way, our galaxy. But nearly everything has a share in this energy: rocks, water, trees, non-human animals. And if a built site or natural element has a lot of Kame, it's said to be a huaca. Huacas have a high concentration of Kame. As a divine ruler who was as important as the sun god Inti, Pachacuti was said to have such an amount of kame that his followers never looked at him directly. Machu Picchu would itself be a huaca, a venerated site full of spiritual importance. And like the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio we just saw, it also has a number of features that align with astronomical phenomena. At dawn on June 21st, the winter solstice, remember this is below the equator, so the seasons are flipped, the Sun Temple is flooded with light in one of its only 2 windows. This dawn sunlight then hits the ground and aligns perfectly with the stone carving. This is to mark the solstice and to honor the most important god, Inti, who was the patron god of the Incas. So we've seen 4 amazing non-Western structures that each relate to the natural world in certain ways. It might be interesting to stop for a moment and think, in what ways are they similar and in which ways are they distinct? Maybe more interesting is to ask, in what way does Western architecture and design differ? For example, compare New York City. Does it take into account of its natural surroundings? Or does it try to dominate nature or keep certain natural elements out? I think this can all be fruitful lines of thought and questioning. But for now, let's move on to the history of landscape painting, which is a key genre for finding views of and on nature. In the Western tradition, it took quite a long time for painters to give natural landscapes their due. It just wasn't deemed to be the most important thing to picture. History scenes, religious iconography, and portraiture were far more important. Not so in many non-Western traditions that understood nature to be of prime importance. Some of the greatest landscape paintings to come to us from China, especially during the Song Dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1279, the Common Era. Shai Gui is one of the most celebrated of Song painters. We know very little about him or his life, and very little of his work has survived. Luckily, this one did, a hand scroll titled 12 Views of Landscape, early 13th century. A hand scroll is a painting, usually with ink on paper, that's rolled up. Like this one, which is more than 27 feet long, they're usually really long. When you see one in a museum, the curators will often have the hand scroll laid all the way open, like it is here, so that you can see the totality. However, this is not how they would have been displayed and used in the past. Instead, they would have only come out on special occasions and only be opened section by section, rolling one part and closing the previous part as one goes along its path. This would be done from right to left, and at the end of the scrolls you'd find calligraphy, often of poetry that relates to the image, and different seals of ownership. What's really striking about this ink painting is how much negative space there is. There's something ethereal and weightless about the whole thing. Xia gives us glimpses of mountains in the distance, barely coming through the fog and mist. Occasionally we get fishermen on their boats. Towards the end of the painting on the left, we do get more solid ground, rocky cliffside with trees growing on top of them. And when we arrive there, the sense of scale suddenly shifts from very far away to much closer. This is a key feature of many Song paintings, namely an effortless shifting of multiple perspectives, all blending together, which gives our eyes seemingly endless space and vistas. During the Song Dynasty, Neo-Confucianism was the dominant school of thought. It was a mixture of 2 important historical, philosophical, and spiritual traditions in China, Confucianism and Taoism, with Buddhist influences as well. Confucianism taught a respect for tradition, for authority figures, for family and ancestors, and sought to cultivate cultural refinement. Part of this refinement came through the study of art, calligraphy, and nature, as in this hand scroll. Taoism, on the other hand, sought a retreat from culture into nature. It taught simplicity and living in accordance with the Tao, the energy that runs through all of nature. In Taoism, nature is an all-powerful force that one must be attuned to and humbled by. We see this too in this hand scroll by Shai Gui. It would take a few centuries for Western painters to give their attention to landscapes. One of the first is Giorgione, a painter of the Venetian Renaissance. Here's The Tempest, which is a mysterious painting. As is often noted, the painting represents less a story, or presents less a story, and more a mood. On the left side, there's a soldier standing guard. On the right is a young mother breastfeeding a baby. Maybe as a thematic echo to Mother Nature. Otherwise, the painting shows a rustic village and a forest landscape. Venetian painters privileged color in their paintings, and Giorgione built up his oil paint to great effect. At this point in Western art history, painters had begun to understand how atmosphere works and how it modulates according to the weather. Is it cold? Hot? Is it humid? Dry? What time of day is it? And what's the season? All of these play a role in how landscapes look, how light travels through the air, and how colors interact with light. And actually, light is color, though they didn't know this yet. Isaac Newton will discover this in the 17th century. With Giorgione, you really get a sense of these weather conditions. If you've ever been outside in the spring or summer and a storm is about to break, you'll know that the air gets heavy, the colors around you become saturated and vivid, and there's a sense of the elements closing in on you a bit. This is what Giorgione is conveying here, and probably no Western painter before him had paid such attention to weather conditions in a landscape before. Moving up to Northern Europe, a little after Giorgione's The Tempest, Flemish and Dutch painters were the masters of landscape painting. They were obsessed with nature. Here's Peter Bruegel's The Elder's Return of the Hunters, also known as Hunters in the Snow, from 1565. Bruegel was great at depicting village scenes, often with humans going about their daily lives, and sometimes poking fun at them by painting them doing silly things. A wealthy banker from Antwerp commissioned Bruegel to do a series of paintings, one for each season. Think of Vivaldi's Four Seasons as a musical example of this. This one, of course, is the winter edition. We see hunters coming back out of the forest with their pack of hunting dogs. To their left, people are tending a fire by the inn, and far below we see throngs of people skating on the ice and playing an old game with sticks that resembles golf. With Bruegel, you get this quasi-bird's-eye view. He's almost giving us a sociological window onto humanity. You also get incredible details, little birds here, accumulated snow there, and people way off in the distance who appear as no more than specks. Above all, you get an incredible sense of color, and like Giorgione, he's giving you the mood of winter as much as anything else. The frozen lakes are the same seafoam green as the sky. The white snow seems to weigh everything down. The distant sun is diffused behind the overcast winter sky, and you can almost feel that satisfying crunch of fresh snow under the men's boots and the dog's paws. A lot of this painting is taken from Bruegel's local context near Antwerp in present-day Belgium, all except those mountain peaks shooting up in the sky, which were painted from memory, specifically from his travels to Italy and his seeing the Alps. This is the second time the Alps make an appearance in this lecture. And speaking of the effect of distance, Bruegel is using what's known as atmospheric perspective, which is a technique that creates the illusion of distance. Just like in our eyes, when something is really far away, it gets hazier, unfocused, and loses color saturation, become paler and less distinct. By having the left foreground super crisp and detailed, while contrasting this with the softer and less opaque colors in the upper middle and right background, Bruegel is able to mimic the way our vision works, notably when space, air, and weather effects accumulate between our eyes and the things we see way off in the distance. During Bruegel's time, there was also the beginning of nations thinking of themselves as nations. For example, the Dutch Republic, which will form in 1581, less than two decades after the return of the hunters. So landscapes like this one were not only about nature and weather effects. Since they literally showed off the land, they were also imbued with national importance. In the same way today we might take pride in the Great Lakes, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, or the Redwood Forest, people across Europe began to tout their landscapes as representing their national cultures. And here's a great example of this by the 17th century Dutch landscape painter Jacob van Riesdael. If Giorgione and Bruegel show us natural landscapes, this one is actually unnatural in the sense that it was a massive landfill project. Before human intervention, this geography was still all sea. In the background rises St. Bavo Cathedral, which may lend this painting religious meaning. By draining and filling this land, that was formerly sea, the Dutch were echoing the biblical time after the flood and Noah's repopulation of the earth according to the Old Testament. But still, it's easy to see that Ruysdael was also more interested in modeling natural elements, was as much interested in modeling natural elements as he was in Judeo-Christian symbolism. More than 2/3 of this painting is rolling clouds playing in the sunlight. On land, workers are laying out linen to bleach in the sun, hence the painting's title, View of Haarlem with Bleaching Grounds. So this painting is not only about national pride in the land and a Christianized love of nature, but also about Dutch industrialism, mercantilism, and the emerging capitalist system that was leaving behind the feudal past. We shouldn't forget, however, that this nation building and capitalist prosperity of Europe during these early modern centuries was predicated on colonization, slavery, and extracting value from the so-called New World, including the Dutch Republic. So the prosperity we're seeing in this painting, which is so calm and idyllic, actually masks a very different reality halfway across the world. One of these places was Suriname, a present-day country on the northern end of South America, which actually began as a Dutch colony in 1667, just 4 years before Ruysdael painted this picture. And colonial exhibitions are also part of this story, and the Western scientific study of the natural world was connected to European colonization. Often artists would be hired aboard ships to travel and document non-Western places and geographies on colonial expeditions. Here's an example that connects directly back to the Dutch colony of Suriname. In 1699, the artist and entomologist Anna Maria Sibylla Marion was commissioned by the city of Amsterdam to study the plants and insects indigenous to Suriname. After spending 2 years exploring and documenting its South American flora and fauna, Marion returned to the Dutch Republic and published her volume of engraved drawings called Metamorphose of Insects in Suriname. Here's one of them, the 9th plate rendering 2 stunning butterflies, a caterpillar and a pomegranate on its branch. It's a really beautiful example of botanical art making. Besides its connection to the European history of colonization, what else can this drawing tell us about the modern Western conception of nature and science? Well, for starters, it tells us that isolation is key. Note that we don't really get a sense of the butterfly's ecosystem. Instead, along with this pomegranate branch, it's plucked from its living context. It also tells us that artists used image making to catalog the natural world, to visualize it, and often bring home specimen for taxonomic study. This iridescent blue butterfly is a Menelaus blue morpho, named after the Greek king from Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. It was given this name by the French taxonomist Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century, whose binomal system is still in use today in biology. So, for example, our taxonomic name is Homo sapiens. Today, this butterfly is in danger of becoming extinct because of deforestation through mining, logging, and cattle grazing. By the time we get to the 19th century, landscape artists are more often than not searching for an escape hatch from modern life and industry. And this is the case with Impressionism, which we've already studied through the painter Renoir. Here we have what's likely the most well-known Impressionist painting. It's by Claude Monet. In fact, it gave the movement its name. When an art critic saw it at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, he ridiculed the painting by saying it was an incomplete sketch and a mere floating impression, or a mere fleeting impression. But that was precisely the point. Impressionist painters would leave Paris to paint in the countryside, and they were interested in the play of natural elements, especially light and water. They tried to capture, in real time, what they were seeing. And if you've ever been to a lake with the sun shining and rippling on its surface, or to the beach and its play of waves and sunlight, you'll know how maddening it must have been for these painters to try and replicate these elements on canvas. And this is a couple decades before the invention of film. What they did then was paint quickly, so to try to give the viewer a sense of movement and directness. They also used complementary colors for certain visual effects, by placing pigments side by side without mixing them, so the color wouldn't get diluted. We see a prime example of this technique in Monet's painting here. So notice the sun and its reflections on the water. It's a reddish-orange disc, that gets echoed below by a cascading set of brushstrokes on the water's surface. When placed next to the bluish green of the sky and the water, these colors start to jump. They oscillate. They start to move, at least in our eyeballs. And amazingly enough, in this static two-dimensional painting, we really do get a sense of shimmering, of a bit of movement, even if only slightly. This is an inherent property of complementary colors, which, as we'll see in next week's session, post-Impressionism will also make good use of. However much Monet sought to escape into his impressions of nature, there's no escaping industry. Notice in the distance, that isn't mist, haze, or clouds. It's emissions coming from smokestacks. This is the port city of Le Havre, which was a major industrial hub in France. While 1872 seems really far away, in a sense, we're in the same predicament, only today the emissions are far greater than they were in Monet's time. In fact, more than half of all greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution were released in the past 30 years. Finally, we arrive at a contemporary example, which in a way is also a landscape. This is a massive installation by the Danish artist Olafur Eliasson. This was in the large Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern Museum in London. And if you're ever there, visiting the Tate Modern is a must. It's amazing. It involved a machine that made mist, reflective mirrors made of foil, and mono-frequency lamps that created one large fake sun. It was one of the most popular installations ever at the Tate. People would come and sit and even lay down to take in the rays of the sun as if they were spending the day at the beach. And on a cloudy or rainy London day, this actually makes a lot of sense. In many ways, we're back to the beginning of this session with this work. Here we have a conception of nature that's almost completely artificial. I say almost completely because remember, the energy used to run this installation would have come from natural resources. It's the perfect artwork for the Anthropocene, where it's now us humans that, in part, make the weather and the climate and wield power over our climate future. It's like those in power hold the ability to turn the real sun up or down, as if the Earth is one big installation. Will we keep emitting carbon and methane into the atmosphere, trapping more heat from the sun, leading to deadly heat waves, rising water, and other disastrous events? Or will we decarbonize and change the way we live in time to avoid the worst-case scenarios?